Beautiful. Okay, so thank you everyone for coming out. I'm not going to speak on the mic because if I put it in front, then it's going to cause an unpleasant noise that no one wants to hear. My name is John Hellman. I'm the president of the Zimmerman First Democrats. And, okay, applause line, great, we love that. For those of you who don't know what the Zimmerman First Democrats are, we are Pike County's first Democratic club dedicated to focusing on LGBTQ issues, working through the Democratic Party here in Pike County. We started earlier this year in February. Lisa Jenkins is the vice president. And you've probably seen us running around all year, causing quite a ruckus and making some people very fulfilled and very upset at the same time. So I am so excited to welcome you all to this really incredible conversation that I can't wait to sit down and nerd out to. I will say I'm 39, and my junior year of college was the first time I had ever heard of the Stonewall riots. And I will never forget how I felt when I learned that there was A, a gay history at all, but B, that there was this momentous event that led to lots of other stuff that happened afterwards. I felt connected to a movement, I felt connected to myself, I felt connected to a history. And I say this because, as everyone should know, that kind of history is under threat everywhere across this country. Part of the reason why we started the Zimmerman First Democrats is because over the last few years, there have been an escalating number of record-breaking years of legislation attacking LGBTQ rights in Pennsylvania and across the country. We need to protect this history because we know that there are LGBTQ kids. For Black history, we know there are Black students, Latino students, there's all these students that if we deny people this history, if we don't learn this history ourselves, not only does it demonstrate that we don't know this country or love this country, but we really eliminate a big chunk of people's lives and people's identities and why the world looks like it is now. So that's all I'm gonna say, and please give a warm round of applause to award-winning journalist and author Lucian Truscott and our friend the mayor, Strub.
Thank you very much. I remember when I was 11 years old and had begun to read the newspapers every day. I can remember in the Des Moines Register where on the page the article was about the perverts in Greenwich Village rioting. I keep wanting to go find the microfiche and find the article, but I'm almost certain I used that word. I didn't know I was gay at that point, but I knew this sort of seared itself into my brain. I can see the page in my head. But it's a real honor to be here with Lucian Truscott. I was so excited to meet Lucian when he first came to the Milford Readers and Writers Festival a few years ago, courtesy of Amy Ferris. And then later Lucian and Tracy moved to Milford because to me Lucian Truscott is sort of royalty of this movement. And Lucian's going to speak in a minute, but he comes from an incredibly distinguished family. I think you're fourth generation West Point? Something like that?
Yeah.
And not only was his coverage of the Stonewall riots at the time considered the most accurate contemporaneous coverage of what happened then, but it was also quite different from a lot of the other coverage, and that Lucian recognized that something really important was happening right then. It wasn't a novelty, it wasn't, look at what the queers in Greenwich Village were doing or something like that. I've got a couple of headlines I'm going to show you. But he in that moment understood he was watching history. And then later, I think when I actually first became aware of Lucian, I wasn't at the time of Stonewall, but when he wrote the novel Dress Gray, about a murder at West Point that Cora Vidal later wrote a screenplay for that was turned into a movie. But I hope the Zimmerman First Democratic Club might have a movie night maybe this winter sometime and show that. The audiovisual capacity is not working, but I have things on my laptop, which you won't be able to see, many of you, but it will prompt us and we can then quote from it. So with that, let me turn it over to Lucian, who's going to share a few thoughts with us.
Can everybody hear? I think I wrote a story for an op-ed page piece for the New York Times on the 40th anniversary of Stonewall. And I think the first line was, I am the most unlikely person in the world to have covered the Stonewall riot. I was a second lieutenant in the Army. I had just graduated from West Point on the 4th of June, 1969. And I had rented a loft down on Broome Street for the summer because I had two months leave. My parents lived out in Hawaii and I didn't want to go to Hawaii. And I did want to go to New York. I had friends in New York. I had already written one article for The Voice, and I started out as a writer writing letters to the editor of The Voice from West Point. And so I was a second lieutenant, and I was in my loft on a Friday night, twiddling my thumbs, and I thought, well, I'm going to go to the Lion's Head, which was a bar 2 bars down from the Stonewall on Christopher Street. And so I walked up from Broome Street, came up 6th Avenue and turned on Waverly Place, hit Sheridan Square Park and turned to the left, and there was the riot, right there. I was just walking along the street and there was a group of, I guess probably at that point, 100 people across from the Stonewall yelling, and the cops had busted the place. This had to be about 12:30 or 1 o'clock in the morning at that time. The cops had busted the place and they were starting to pull people out in handcuffs. And they didn't have a paddy wagon yet, but they were loading a few people into the backs of squad cars, and so I walked up, and the crowd was, some of the crowd came from inside the Stonewall, the rest of the crowd sort of emptied out of the gay bars in the village, because the word spread pretty fast, something was happening at the Stonewall. And I was there when the first pennies were thrown. They started throwing pennies. They were catcalling, calling the cops pigs and so forth, and calling to the patrons that were in there, and the patrons were calling to them and waving, and like this, and their hands were cuffed. And then I was there when they threw the first paving stone, cobblestone, through the window of the place. And I was there when they lit the fire in the window. They tried to break the window with the garbage can I was standing on, but I told them to go find another garbage can, and they did. But what Sean said is exactly right. It was an extraordinary moment. I had no way of knowing on that Friday night what I was looking at. It looked like a bunch of, the crowd was very young. A lot of them were teenagers. The oldest were probably in their early 20s. The crowd at the Stonewall was young. It was a bar that was known to serve underage patrons. And most of the people that were on the street were what we would call bridge and tunnel people. They were from Queens and New Jersey and Brooklyn, and they didn't live in the village. And as I said, they were young, and they were all gay, and they had nothing to lose. That was the difference in the crowd that was outside the Stonewall and the crowd that was being busted from inside the Stonewall. Was they were not, young men in their 30s who had jobs uptown at banks or publishing houses or something. When other gay bars would be busted, people would come out with their jackets over their faces so that people on the street didn't see them, much less any news cameras. Of course, there were no news cameras. But you know, so these were young people, and they had nothing to lose, and the cops were pissing them off, and so they said, essentially, we're not gonna take this anymore. And I later, I think it was in the New York Times on the 40th anniversary, I called it the Rosa Parks moment for the gay movement. It was that I'm not gonna sit on the back of the bus, I'm not gonna get busted in a gay bar just because I'm gay and just because I've decided to go out to a bar and have a drink. I should say right now, I should describe for a moment what it was like in New York right then in 1969 for gay people when it came to the bar scene. The gay bars in New York City, all of them, every single one of them, were owned by the mob. Most of them were unlicensed. They didn't have liquor licenses because it was illegal. It was, believe it or not, illegal to serve gay people liquor. And so the mob opened bars, didn't get liquor licenses, paid off the cops, and that's what gay bars were. And it's extraordinary to think now what it must have been like to be a gay person in 1969 and decide I'm gonna go out and get a drink with my friends or see if anybody's hanging out at Julius or the Stonewall. And you knew you were running the risk of getting busted. You knew that the cops could come in at any moment and arrest the people in the Stonewall or in Julius or in any of the other gay bars that were down Christopher Street and really all over the village. But that was the fact of life, one of the facts of life for gay people in New York. And what that meant was the gay community in New York lived in the closet. And I only knew a few people back then, and even in coming years, who were out of the closet. Allen Ginsberg was out of the closet. I mean, it's extraordinary to think that to know a gay person who was out of the closet, you had to go find Allen Ginsberg. I mean, really, you know, I mean, it just, I mean, some of the people that worked at The Voice, who were gay, were out of the closet in The Voice. Everybody in The Voice knew. But they didn't write articles in The Voice saying, you know, the theater critic, Michael Smith, is a wonderful, wonderful guy. He didn't write articles about the off-Broadway scene saying, as a gay man, comma, you know, he just reviewed the plays. And of course, almost all the plays that he was reviewing were written by gay people, and they were in gay bars, and they were, you know, La Mama over in the East Village, Cafe Chino on Cornelia Street, Joe Chino was gay, you know. The theater scene in New York, especially off-Broadway, but most especially off-Broadway, was entirely gay. You didn't read that. Nobody that was gay who was writing about it wrote about it because everybody was in the closet. Well, these guys on June the 27th, 1969, were in the closet to their home, to their families back in New Jersey or out in Queens or wherever they were. But that night on the street in New York City, they certainly weren't in the closet. And they stood up and they said, we're not gonna take this anymore. And so some of them started throwing cobblestones. They broke the front window of the Stonewall. The guy that was trying to grab the garbage can from underneath me grabbed another one and broke the window of the Stonewall. Another guy went down the street and got newspaper and other garbage out of a garbage can, threw it in the window of the Stonewall and started a fire. It's part of the history, it's part of gay history, let's put it that way. The way they put that fire out, okay? The Stonewall was such an illegal bar that they did not have a a sink behind the bar to wash glasses in. They had a hose, and they used a hose with a little trigger thing on it to fill up like bourbon and water or scotch and water and all that. So when the fire started, the cops grabbed the hose from behind the bar and put the fire out with the hose that was used by bartenders to fill gay drinks.
Because the cops were blocked in there at that time.
Yeah, the cops were blocked in there. The gay people took over the Christopher Street. The paddy wagon drove off. The cops fled into the bar. Two guys picked up they were working on the street. And so one of the things that they did while they were putting in paving stones was to take out a couple of parking meters. They were lying on the sidewalk, so they picked up a parking meter and used it as a battering ram on the front door of the Stonewall. And so the cops were barricaded in there. Finally, around, I guess probably 2 o'clock then, a whole bunch of squad cars from 6th Precinct came screaming down Christopher Street and broke up the crowd. And the Friday night part of the riot was over. But I reread, I found this in my files. This is the original of my story in the Village Voice, published on July the 3rd. This is some of the writing that was on the front of the Stonewall, and this was a picture here of here's the Stonewall sign and a bunch of very young guys there. And the story of that photograph, I should probably tell, that was taken on Saturday night around 8 o'clock before the riot started on Saturday night.
The riots, it began on Friday night and then it continued.
And it didn't continue for 24 hours. There was a Friday night riot, a Saturday night riot, and then a Sunday kind of a gathering. Anyway, Howard Smith and I had called up Fred and said, there's going to be action on the street on Saturday night.
Fred McDarrah, the photographer for the Village Voice.
The photographer. Fred McDarrah was a veteran of the 101st Airborne Division who landed at Normandy. That's who Fred was. And he wore his battle jacket all the time. And so Fred showed up, and he was a great street photographer, all that stuff. He showed up in a coat and tie. And I thought, what the? And he walks up to me and he says, Lucian, where's the riot? And I said, it hasn't started yet, Fred. And he said, well, I'm going to the theater. He said, what am I gonna get a picture of? There's nothing to take a picture of. So I said, give me a couple of minutes. And I gathered these guys and posed them in front of the Stonewall. So that's fake news right there. Anyway, the Saturday night part of the riot was violent. The tactical patrol force showed up, and the tactical patrol force was a sort of SWAT before SWAT. They had helmets and face shields and nightsticks. They didn't have those, plastic shields and all that shit. They had nightsticks. And they were told to clear the streets. And so probably it had to be 500 to 1,000 gay people had gathered in the Sheridan Square, 4th Street, 10th Street comes across 9th Street, Grove Street, Waverly Place area there. And we're filling that whole area that's called Sheridan Square. And the cops came down from 6th Avenue with their nightsticks and started to clear the streets. And I'll just stop and tell you right now another funny part of the story. When I got in the Army 2 months later, I went to Fort Benning, and then I went to Fort Carson. One of the first jobs I was given in the Army was to teach a class on riot control. So I got a blackboard out and drew a map of Sheridan Square and taught the Sheridan Square riot how not to do riot control. Well, a colonel came by and was watching the class that I taught, and he went and told the general, and they opened an old World War II theater about 3 blocks away and had every battalion in that division come and get riot control instruction from me on the Sheridan Square riot. And I gave a lecture every day for a week, 2 lectures. Anyway, that Saturday night, the guys that were on the street rioting, you know, whether they came from Queens and Long Island or wherever or not, they went to the village all the time. They were young, they were gay, this is where they came to be themselves, you know, and they knew the village. Tactical patrol force guys came from precincts all over the city, and they loaded them in buses, they drove them down to the village. Most of them have probably never been there before except as tourists. So these gay guys just ran circles around them. I mean, they would chase them down to 7th Avenue, they turned right, went up to 9th Street, went straight across, came down Waverly Place, came right up behind them. And the cops are going like this. And one time I was standing outside the Lion's Head watching this, and they hadn't unleashed the tear gas yet. So things were kind of, I mean, I described it in the voice as festive. And it was. I mean, these young guys were having a hell of a good time. And nobody had the sense, I certainly didn't, when I was at the riot, what was happening. I reread this story tonight, and I read it with new eyes, because Sean and I talked the other day, and I knew I was getting ready for this. And I can see myself going through, as I read this story, trying to figure out what I had just seen. This was Friday night, Saturday night, Sunday night. I wrote the story when I got back to the loft on Sunday night and handed it in on Monday morning. That's how quickly it happened. So that's how little time I had to consider, you know, what I had seen. But while I was watching the riot, and while these kids were rioting, none of them had any idea what they were doing except, we're not going to take it anymore. And I didn't really have the concept of that was what they were saying until I saw the signs that were written on Saturday saying gay power. You guys, or most of you, are old enough to remember the words black power. Gay power was a takeoff from that, and it was a logical takeoff. This was an oppressed group, just like black people were, and they took the slogan black people had used and turned it and put gay on the front of power and called it gay power. And at that point, I started to get an inkling, this is something special. And so when I wrote the story, you know, I said that the gay movement has started at the end of it. And Allen Ginsberg pointed out how different it was on Sunday. You know, he pointed out, we walked from Sheridan Square across to Cooper Square, and he was going to 10th Street and I was going down Lafayette. We were talking as we walked along, and he was saying, I mean, he had lived in New York all these years, you know, since the 50s, and he was Allen Ginsberg. And he was talking about how much things had changed. And I quoted him in the article, saying something that was extraordinary then, and it's still extraordinary. He said, the fags have lost that wounded look they all had 10 years ago. And he was right. He was absolutely right. The looks on the faces of those kids who were rioting was ebullient. They were out of the closet, completely, totally out of the closet. And they were being who they were. And they were being who they were in public. And they were defying the establishment that had put its thumb on them and pressed down on them their whole lives, all 17 or 18 years, however old they were. But, when I read this, I can see myself feeling my way through the experience as I wrote it on Sunday night, trying to understand, what had happened. Even as I wrote the thing on Sunday night, I had no idea what was really starting. What started was the movement that led to gay people being able to serve openly in the military, same-sex people being allowed to get married, everything we know now, started on that Friday night. And to think of that is just mind-blowing. And to think that I was there, really mind-blowing to me. I mean, it really, I still sort of have a hard time wrapping my mind around it. Anyway, the riot on Saturday, they got out tear gas, and the gay people chased the cops. The cops chased them all around the village. At one point, the cops were all marching along with this lockstep thing that they did, and a bunch of guys went around Waverly Place and down 7th Avenue and came up behind them and formed a kick line, like the Rockettes. Their arms on each other's shoulders.
Wow.
And we're doing a kick line like this and singing, "We are the Stonewall girls, we wear our hair in curls, we don't wear underwear, we show our pubic hair." As the cops, right behind the cops, like from here to that table, the cops turned around and they all went and took off. I mean, you're laughing because it was funny. It was really funny. And that kick line was what started the tear gas. Too much fun was being had. And the cops decided to, take care of the fun and turned on the tear gas. And it was, so Sunday, right around, I guess it was like 10 or 11, things had slowed down and, people were going in the Stonewall, but the Stonewall was a pit to begin with. It was an even worse pit now. So people were going off to other gay bars and all that. And I looked across 7th Avenue and there was Allen Ginsberg and Taylor Mead, who was one of the famous Warhol stars, and a writer, and a poet, and an actor. And so I walked over there, and I knew Allen, and I knew Taylor, and so Taylor said, "Lucian, what is going on here?" So I started telling him what was going on, and Allen said, "This happened where? The Stonewall?" And I said, "Yeah, the Stonewall." And he said, "I've never been in there. Will you take me there?" So I said, "Yeah, sure." So we walked across and went in the Stonewall. And there were still people in there. They had a sound system. The Stonewall was also double illegal because it didn't have a cabaret license, which you needed if you were going to have dancing. And they had dancing. So the dancing was going on in the back room. And Allen walks through and people are recognizing him. And I don't know whether you've ever been around Allen Ginsberg, but he doesn't walk, he bounces. He walks like this. His head goes up and down as he walks. He's just this sort of happy guy. He walks like that. And he was sort of bouncing in the Stonewall. And he said, "Oh my God, they're playing music, there's dancing. come on, Lucian, let's dance. So we went in the back room and danced. So I danced with Allen Ginsberg at the gay riot. It started the gay movement. I told you I was an unlikely guy to be covering this thing. Second Lieutenant Truscott and Allen Ginsberg danced in the back room of the Stonewall on the last night of the riot.
Wow. Wow.
If I get a big enough headstone on my grave, I could probably have that written. That would be right up there with other interesting things I've done. But Alan, as we walked back over there to Cooper Square, he was telling me, he said, this is starting something. This is amazing. This is happening. This is amazing. And he was absolutely right. That following week, actually starting on Sunday, I started to see gay couples walking through the village holding hands. Before midnight. You could see gay people holding hands when they came out of the bars at midnight or 1 o'clock. Very few people around. Everybody had quite a bit to drink and so forth. But at 8 o'clock and 7 o'clock, and people walking to the riot were holding hands. And then later that week, you started to see more people walking around the village, gay people holding hands. It really, that open displays of affection between gay people as a thing started that weekend in New York City, and continued right from then. So it's probably also useful to tell you the other thing that I'm rather famous for, and I'm happy about. When I wrote the story, I was clueless about, gay people were queers and fags and all that stuff. I used the word fag right there on the front page of the Village Voice. When the Voice came out on Wednesday, long about Friday, Jim Forat and the Gay Activists Alliance had the first demonstration of the gay movement against me for using the word fag out in front of the Voice. So, and they were making a ruckus, So Dan Wolf, they demanded to see the editor. So Dan Wolf said, bring them up here. So Forat, a couple of other guys went up there and they said, we demand you stop using the word fag. And Wolf said, okay. So I was responsible for the Village Voice stopping using the word fag because I used the word fag. And the first demonstration was against me. So I'm proud of that. I am.
You should.
It gave them something to demonstrate against right then. Immediately that week they had something to demonstrate against. And that started the gay movement that went on from there.
And you and Jim are friends today. You and Jim Forat are friends today.
Oh yeah, we've been friends ever since. But yeah, I've known him for 55 years. So anyway, that's the story of the Stonewall riot. So I think.
Okay, so let's look at a couple of the images, and they'll prompt, I think, some additional stories. That you were talking about the cops being brought in from elsewhere, and the kids there knowing the village. For those of you who don't know this part of the village, or forgot what it was like when you first walked around there, it's unbelievably confusing, right? You think 4th Street and 10th Street would be parallel 6 blocks apart. They intersect. Waverly Place intersects itself. You can meet someone at the corner of Waverly Place and Waverly Place. That's how it looks like spaghetti streets.
All of this within about 200 yards.
Yeah.
Right in this one nest of streets.
All right. Now, not many of you are going to be able to see this, but we'll see. So this is a sign, this is a raided premises, Police Department, City of New York. Raids were very common. Even, I remember from the 1980s when bars were still getting raided, or when the lights would flash, you had to stop dancing with the same sex partner and find an opposite sex partner, this sort of thing. This was still very common in the early 80s.
Wow.
Howard R. Leary, police commissioner. This is a picture of some of the gang outside there. That's a drag queen in the back of a paddy wagon.
That's another night on another bust.
Yeah, I'm not guaranteeing all these are from the.
No, they're not, I looked at them, but they are emblematic of everything that was happening in New York at that time. That's the picture I posed.
The picture. That's a picture, it looks like some people being shoved. Sorry. This I'm guessing might have been like Sunday maybe?
Yeah.
Or maybe Saturday.
Yeah, that's Sunday.
Is that the
Sunday
Northern
night.
Dispensary? I think, look, that's in the
Yeah,
corner.
that's the Northern Dispensary, which was just down the street. Yeah,
And I'm not sure, is that Jim Perrette right there? It looks a little bit like
no,
it isn't, okay.
that would have been at one of the first gay marches.
One of the first
Yeah.
marches, okay. Drag is out in the open, the sign says. Now where was this? It says, "We homosexuals plead with our people to please help maintain peaceful and quiet conduct on the streets of the village." Mattachine Society was one of the first gay rights organizations. It actually precedes the Gay Activists Alliance and Gay
Well,
Liberation.
guess where it was? Upstairs,
Above the Stonewall?
above the 55.
I don't know.
Yeah,
This is the Voice article, and the picture and the graffiti on the cover.
the mob wrote this. Gay prohibition, corrupt cops feed mafia. The mafia was, of course, the mafia owned the Stonewall, and the mafia paid off the cops. And one of the common reasons they busted gay bars was to extort more payments from them. This was not a bust for that, however. The real reason they busted the Stonewall was the mob was running an extortion racket out of there. If you walked from Wall Street up to the village and you came up 6th Avenue, the Stonewall was the first bar you hit. And Wall Streeters who were gay and in the closet would walk up on Friday nights or whatever from Wall Street, and there's a gay bar, and go in it, and they would entrap these guys. They would get young guys, fix them up and all that stuff, and then they had an upstairs room in there, upstairs, and it was set up with cameras, and they would shoot pictures of them and then extort money from them. That is why that bust took place.
There's
To
a huge
bust up
blackmail
that-
operation going on.
Yeah, to bust up that blackmail and extortion ring.
This is perhaps one of my very favorite headlines from the Daily News. Homo nest raided, queen bees are stinging mad. That's the headline in the Daily News, right? Gays riot again, remember the Stonewall. 3 cops hurt as bar raid riles crowd. Police raid on New York club sets off first gay riot. There's some pictures of Lucian.
That's,
Oh, wow.
that's a couple of years later. It's 1971. I was living on a barge on the Hudson River in that picture. And that picture was the picture taken from the back of Jeff Scrape.
I'm sure Lucian going into the Stonewall could have made a whole lot of new friends. That's the Voice office. Was that the Voice office then?
No, actually, not that night. The next year, the Voice office was on the corner. And by the way, if any of you went to see the Bella movie, Bella's headquarters was in the old Voice office. And that picture of her standing in front of that sign saying Bella Abzug, that was on the side of the old Voice building. And And the Lion's Head, which was next door to the Village Voice, was the Bell Labs headquarters drinking bar. That's where Doug Ireland, who was her campaign manager, drank there. A very, very good friend of mine.
That's the cover of Dress Gray. This is Marcia Johnson and Sylvia Rivera. I don't know that it's that night, but first of all, if everyone I've ever met who claimed to have been at Stonewall that night gathered, Yankee Stadium wouldn't be large enough. So here you have actually someone who's here. There's a huge, there's a huge amount of controversy or who was there, who wasn't there, whatever. And of course, a lot of people came the second night who weren't there the first night. So, but this is Marcia Johnson, Marcia P. Johnson, who subsequently there's been a movie made about her, and I remember Marcia and Sylvia both.
And she was busted on Friday night.
That's Marcia and Sylvia again. Then so what happened after Stonewall is, the next year was the Pride marches began, and they expanded from there. Actually, I think
And it was illegal. They marched up Fifth Avenue. It was no permit, and so it was not legal,
And it spawned them all over the country. In Los Angeles, I think the parade committee today is still called the Christopher Street West Committee. In Stonewall, of course, it means something to us now. It wasn't just the name of the bar because it has Stonewall in it. Now it's two gay guys have a jelly company called Stonewall. I mean, it's everywhere. It's a brand that means something. And it sometimes people say it wasn't that there wasn't any activism before that. There were some organizations, there were some conflicts, the Compton cafeteria, sort of a disruption in California. But this was the first time that it was ever on this kind of scale where we were striking back against the sort of civil code that oppressed us.
There was a drink-in at Julius in '63 or something like that. The Voice covered it, and there's a famous picture that is part of gay history that Fred McNair took of the two guys that went in there to say, "I'm gay and I want a drink." The whole bar was gay. The bartender was gay, but they went in and said, I'm gay and I want a drink. And then the cops came in, and they did it to disrupt the SLA, the liquor laws.
Right. Well, I remember Barney's Beanery in West Hollywood. Even in my lifetime, it had no faggots, a sign behind the bar.
Should I tell the story about Ballroom?
Sure.
Yeah. This is not an outgrowth of my coverage of the Stonewall, but it was an outgrowth of me working at the Village Voice. A few years later, some 10 gay men that were lawyers and doctors and stockbrokers got together and decided they would open a cabaret, a gay cabaret, and it was called the Ballroom, and they applied for a liquor license as out of the closet gay men, and were refused the liquor license. So they called Mary Nichols, the city editor of The Voice, and said, "Why don't you guys do a story on this? Gay people can't get a liquor license." So Mary called me in and said, there was a mob bar right next to where I lived on Houston Street, Houston and Sullivan. And on Friday and Saturday nights, limos from New Jersey and Connecticut and Long Island were triple parked on Houston Street. There was only one lane of Houston Street going to the west because of that lineup of limos and black Cadillacs out there. So Mary said, why don't you get the license plates of all the cars parked there this Saturday and Friday and Saturday night, and I've got an SLA guy. She knew a guy in the state liquor authority, and he'll run the plates, and then you can write a story that says they won't allow gay people to have a liquor license, but the mob is serving these gangsters every night in this bar. So I got the license plates. I took binoculars and looked out my window and wrote them down. I didn't want to be seen writing down mob license plates on the
Not a
street.
good idea.
So, I gave the license plate numbers to Mary. Mary got the names. I wrote the story. And so Mary didn't tell me she was gonna do this, but she did it. She took my story and the SLA guy and went up, made an appointment to go see the SLA commissioner, State Liquor Authority commissioner. And she went up there and said, either you give the ballroom a license or we run this story on Wednesday.
Oh.
And I named the SLA commissioner, corrupt, payoffs, mob payoffs. I had all this shit in the story. So my story never ran, but the ballroom got its license. I never paid for a drink at the ballroom or Reno Sweeney. The second bar that was gay on, that got a license on 13th Street. Ballroom was on West Broadway. It moved, but it started out on West Broadway. Anyway, that's how gay people are allowed to get. Mary Nichols and I blackmailed them.
It's also, that's really important though in sort of another context, because up until this time, the gay movement was kind of a subset of the cultural revolution that came out of the 60s, right? It was a sexual liberation movement. It had something to offer everybody, to liberate oneself sexually. And then when the oppression from police, the raiding the bars, the not being able to get liquor license, the arresting people and whatever, and entrapment and so on, that began a focus that the Stonewall riots really accelerated to the gay movement becoming a legal reform movement. And instead of being a sexual liberation movement, which was still that, it was really looking at changing the laws. In the 60s, you'd see gay power signs, these things, you look back at the old stuff, you wouldn't see much gay rights. The concept of gay rights really started to come in, around this time. And so in those years after that, and sort of, we got a couple of slides here, I think. There we are. So all the parades, the marches, all over the country. I remember the Gay People's Union at the University of Iowa in Iowa City had their first march in 1971. It was organized out of the Unitarian Church. I don't know what we would have done without Unitarians at the time. But then within a few years, so the American Psychological Association had changed the DSM, the Diagnostic Manual, to declassify homosexuality as a medical disorder. Lambda Legal Defense was formed. National Gay Task Force was formed. And the picture I was showing here that I keep bouncing out of.
There.
Yeah, so this picture, in 1977, so less than 10 years from Stonewall, we had the first meeting in the White House, just to show how far this had come. This is a picture with Gene O'Leary, Gloria Steinem, Midge Costanza, Arthur Lawrence, Bella Abzug, and Bruce Beller. Bruce and Gene were the co-executive directors of the National Gay Task Force, it was called then. Gene was an ex-nun. Midge Costanza was a special assistant to President Carter, the first woman ever appointed as a special assistant to a president, and Gene's girlfriend, but that wasn't well known. Gloria and Bella were there, as they always were for everything. Bella and Ed Koch introduced the first gay rights bill in Congress in 1974, again, just a few years after this. And of course, they represented the district. The political energy came out of the neighborhoods. It came out of the gayborhoods, right? And it was around very local issues, raiding the bars and things like this. And Bruce Beller, incidentally, was a microbiologist, and he became obsessed might be too strong a word, but really, really focused on gay men's health. He started a foundation called the Mariposa Foundation in the late 70s because he recognized there's something happening around gay men's health. And I knew all these people. Then Harvey Milk was elected in San Francisco in '77. So these are all things that came out just in the few years right after that.
He was the first elected, out of the closet, gay elected official, wasn't he?
Not quite.
Not quite.
Kathy Kovacs, I think her name was elected to the Ann Arbor City Council.
Oh, okay.
These are the very important nuances, and believe me, that's come up a million times. But Harvey really was elected on a gay platform as well, and his whole thing was come out wherever you are, and it was really like that was his mantra. I'm from Woodside, New York, his sign says. But then, just as quickly, the backlash occurred. Anita Bryant, our first victories, our first political victories, it wasn't passing bills in Congress or in state legislatures. It was at the municipal level. It was with cities. It was with passing non-discrimination ordinances in St. Paul and Lawrence, Kansas, Eugene, Oregon, Iowa City, Iowa, Ann Arbor, Michigan, university towns, you might know, and then Dade County. In Dade County, Florida was the first really big one, and then that really engendered a reaction led by Anita Bryant. Anita Bryant, most of you know who she is, I can tell by age, but those of you who don't, was a beauty queen and was, I don't know, was she Miss America or runner-up Miss America or something? It doesn't matter. And was the spokesperson for the Florida orange juice industry. And she started Save Our Children, and her whole thing was around gay people are here to recruit you and to corrupt your children and so on. And she began this campaign to overturn the ordinance in Dade County. It was very successful. She won by a large margin. It was the first kind of political electoral thing that sort of mobilized a national constituency around it. Ethan Ghetto ran the campaign against it, and it made her. Oh, sorry, that's another thing. That's. Got her on the cover of Newsweek. And just a little code into that. Her husband later came out as gay. And I think her daughter is now married to a woman. So just. And of course, Harvey was elected, and just about a year later, he was assassinated with George Moscone at San Francisco City Hall. So then, in more recent years, there's been as the Stonewall riots and episode became sort of seen as such this turning point in history, something so important. There have been various efforts underway to recognize the history. In the late 70s, George Segal, a sculptor, was commissioned to create the sculpture for the little Christopher Street Park right in front of two men standing and two women sitting. That became its own drama within some circles. Why were the women sitting, the men standing? That's another thing. But that's still there today. It didn't get installed until 1992, even though it was commissioned in '79, because it was its own controversy. The Stonewall Inn was recognized as an historic place. It has a plaque on it. And then it became a National Historic Site. Then it became a National Historic Monument. So now the Christopher Street subway sign says Christopher Street Stonewall National Monument Station. And there's a big sign on the park. And the Stonewall National Monument Visitor Center opened just a few weeks ago, which you're encouraged to go see. I did want to say, because Lucian, you touched on it, but I think it's a really important point to understand, is the people who prompted this, it wasn't the middle class gay guys, right? Because at the time, they weren't out. They couldn't be out. The only people who could be out of the closet were either people of so much privilege, right? They didn't have to worry about earning a living, or they were artists, they were already living in kind of a bohemian on the edges sort of thing, that they could withstand it, or people had absolutely nothing, right? These kids, or, Marsha Johnson lived in the streets, So it was at either end, and what the movement has sort of created since then, dramatically accelerated by the AIDS epidemic, which pushed a generation of gay men out of the closet, is it created the opportunity for, the factory worker, the middle class people, the people working in a bank to come out of the closet and be themselves. So why don't we go to questions? All the way in the back. We'll start there, then Nancy.
forgive me if I stutter this out a little bit, just because it's important to me, and then I'll wind up a little bit. Last night I had a dream. I grew up in Switzerland. Last night I had a dream in German. I hadn't dreamt in German in 50 years. And the feeling of the dream was I was a German Jew and had to make my way to England because it was the safe. I had to go underground to make myself to England because it would be safe in England. And this morning I woke up and the New York Times said that it looks like the GOP will be taking control of the Senate.
The what?
The GOP will be taking control of the Senate.
And I remember visiting V.S. Naipaul, the writer in England. And he reminded me that civilization doesn't go in one track. We forget that for 500 years, humanity lost the science and art of taking a bath every day. And in the Middle Ages. And I'm stuttering because I don't know how to get this out, but this, I hadn't dreamt in German in 50 years, and the importance of this dream just really hit me. Can you riff on, first of all, thank you for being a witness at such an important, and such a great witness at such an important time in history. But now can I ask you to call on that knowledge to talk about how you see things unfolding in the here and now?
Well, they're already unfolding. You know, the extraordinary thing about the last, let's say, 40 years, but especially the last 10 or 15 years, is all these wars we thought we won, we're fighting again. You know, every time you wake up, there's another attempt to reverse something that has already been passed. I mean, you know, they overturned Roe v. Wade, of course, and Clarence Thomas even wrote into his concurrence that he would like to take on gay marriage and Oberville. And so you're right that history isn't in a straight line. It's a whole bunch of bumps, and you climb a mountain, you get to the top, and there's an enemy up there who starts shooting at you and wants you to go back down the mountain. That's what happens, I think, in just like in relations between countries, that happens, and in the laws of this country and laws of other countries. What is the phrase? You know, one step ahead, two steps back. So, I mean, I don't see in my lifetime that any of this kind of thing is ever going to end. There are too many people that have extraordinarily strong religious beliefs about this stuff, as ridiculous as that is. So you're never gonna convince them. And ever since Falwell, they started their own, just like gay people started a movement. The religious people started a political movement with Falwell, and part of their movement was to keep gay people in the closet. And look what Republicans. There's another New York Times story yesterday or the day before about Republicans running anti-trans ads. I mean, you know, some Republican up there decided, gee, we're not going to win very many votes just screaming about gay people, but we've still got trans. So they're using the trans movement. I mean, I don't even know how to put it. I mean, the fact of trans people and the fact that trans people are in the public, you know, out of the closet, so to speak, to garner votes. These things are never going to end.
The audacity of them to exist is the
the audacity of people to be themselves. You know, it's hard for me to think, sitting here, that I never had a moment in my life where I couldn't be myself.
Mm.
That's what they, you know, the word they use that for that now is privilege. I'm not sure that it's privilege as much as it just is fact. But gay people, at the time that I was growing up and right up until that night that we've been talking about, had to be someone else all the time in public, or not in front of their parents or their friends or whatever. And that's, you know, that all by itself is just one of the most extraordinary things about the human condition that I can possibly think of, because you are who you are. Black people are black. Gay people are gay. Straight people are straight. The problem, of course, was it was okay to be a white straight guy, but not okay to be black and not okay to be gay. But in our lifetimes, everyone in this room, in our lifetimes, we've changed this. We've brought change to these incredibly horrible and ignorant parts of the human condition, and that's something that we can celebrate, which is what we're doing tonight, I think. And it's something that we're all fighting for, and we'll continue to fight for.
I think if there's one thing that you know, I get frustrated when I particularly speak with young people and young activists, is their failure to understand how fragile these gains are. You know, I think, you know, Trump is reelected. I think it's highly likely that marriage equality will get overturned by the Supreme Court, as Roe v. Wade was, which is why states are trying to then, you know, they're going to throw it back to the states, right? Well, Pennsylvania has no such protection, so tried to get a law passed in Pennsylvania to protect same-sex marriage in the event that happens, and you know, our state representative here voted against that. So it's all very fragile, but it's also at the same time, this club is named after Marie Zimmerman, who lived very openly with her companion, Faye Allen, who was a vaudeville actor. They lived in the farm now in the national park. She was famous for not allowing men on her property, and she supposedly shot and killed a deer without getting out of bed one morning. She was the first woman member who was admitted to the Blooming Grove Hunt Club out in the western part of the country. But James Peirce is also very interesting. He was a professor at Harvard, James Mills Peirce. He was the brother of Charles Saunders Peirce. Charles Saunders Peirce was sort of the father of pragmatism. He was a philosopher and mathematician, also taught at Harvard. He came to Milford in the 1880s to create a utopian community for intellectuals, clearly destined to failure. The Park Service, his house is out on the 3-lane. It's that big house with the stone on the left side of the 3-lane. He was, if you know the Dewey Decimal System, John Dewey, the educator, was his protege. Peirce was his mentor. There's a global Charles Peirce Society that Umberto Eco is the head of. So he's a very important guy, you know, historically. His brother, James Mills Peirce, was also quite brilliant, taught at Harvard. He was kicked out of Harvard in the purge in the 1920s when scores of students and faculty members, the gay ring, right, you know, were kicked out. For several decades, there had been a mystery in the, you know, emerging history of queer scholarship. Jonathan Ned Katz, who's now in his mid-80s, he lives in the Village, in the house he was born in on Jane Street, years ago wrote a book, and he had found a letter, and it was to Edward Carpenter, or the other guy, one of the British guys who were Bohemian socialists, intellectuals in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And he found this letter that had been written to him, signed Professor X, and it was from someone in the US. And in that letter, he had read something that this guy had written, In that letter, this Professor X envisioned and referred to the idea of civil rights for homosexuals. And the word homosexual was fairly new then, but this was something that no one had even imagined, the idea of civil rights for it. And of course, he couldn't sign his name to it because the risk that would carry. And a few years ago, some boxes of papers at Harvard that had been locked and closed for 50 years after his death or something were opened, and it turned out that letter was written by James Mills Peirce. So he's got a Democratic club named after him now. But the point of that is that he had this idea, envisioned this sort of concept that no one could understand, no one else had in 1893. And it took a long time to us, in the scope of history, not so long. And look where that goes. There are people around us today who have similar ideas that are so difficult to understand or seem so radical. There will be a time when I think we look at this era and think of what's been happening to trans people, particularly trans women, getting slaughtered all over the country. Not unlike how we think of the waves of lynchings in the 19-teens and 20s. We will look at how we have dealt with migrants and immigrants and people who are homeless in ways that society at some point will really feel that shame, the way much of society does, how we treat people around race and sexual orientation. So even as depressing as some of this is, and the battle is so intense, what's Dr. King's famous, the arc of history bends towards justice. I'm sure somebody can have some clever caveat to that, because in the process it takes a few zigzags on the way. Anyway, other questions? I saw there was another, Nancy.
I'm not sure how to phrase this, but you have a military background, you're a white, straight man, and yet you approach this event with what seems like almost a clean slate of acceptance of what is. And I'm interested in who you were before, in terms of how you felt about gayness, and where you saw yourself in this, and was this something that you dealt with